40 years ago, you had a televised debate on the Dutch TV with Michel Foucault, probably the most influential contemporary French intellectual. You said that you had never met anybody so amoral. And indeed, he is widely viewed as the main defender of postmodernism and moral relativism. But what is wrong with that? Don't you see that ethical norms vary widely across space and time? Slavery, subjugation of women, repression of homosexuals have been accepted in many cultures and still are. Here, it is a scandal to make caricatures of the Holocaust, but it is considered admirable to make caricatures of the Prophet. In Iran, it's the other way around. The terrorists of the Israelis are the freedom fighters of the Palestinians. Muslims think that their religion is truly universal, and Christians think likewise, but for their religion, while secularists think secularism is the only solution. Isn't truth itself, including scientific truth, always the effect of regimes of truth, as Foucault called them, that are inextricably linked to power? Isn't there something, both parochial and imperialist, in asserting one's own value system as being, quote, truly universal, unquote? If there are truly objective and universal moral norms, how do you discover and justify them?
Moral relativism, it's a little difficult to discuss. It's a little bit like discussing skepticism. There are no skeptics. You can discuss it in a philosophy seminar, but no human being can in fact be a skeptic. They wouldn't survive for 2 minutes if they were, so they're not. And I think pretty much the same is true of moral relativism. There are no moral relativists. There are people who profess it. You can discuss it abstractly, but it doesn't exist in ordinary life. And to sharpen the discussion a little, we should recognize that the concept moral relativism ranges over quite a broad spectrum. So there's a form of moral relativism which is totally uncontroversial. Of course it's true. There are, as to quote this, there are ethical norms that vary widely over space and time. And that's just an observation of fact. Nobody denies that. Similarly, every other aspect of humans varies quite widely. So, for example, human visual systems can vary quite widely in the way they function, depending on early experience. Actually, it's been shown by experiment, not with humans, but with other animals with essentially the same visual system, that you can change them radically just by early experience. Every biological system, and I assume we're biological organisms, so our moral values and ethical systems are also biological systems. Every one of them can vary quite widely depending on experience. That's not controversial. So, for example, the human visual system can be varied experimentally so that it will have different distributions of receptors that respond to horizontal and vertical lines, and that'll give very different perception. You can show it with cats and monkeys. We have the same visual system. On the other hand, you can't turn a human visual system into an insect visual system as you change experience. And this is quite general across the biological domain, including moral systems. There's a range of options that's possible. There's variation within that range, but there are also limits to the range. And in fact, this takes us to there's a tendency to move from the uncontroversial concept of moral relativism to a concept that is, in fact, incoherent. And that's to say that moral values can range indefinitely. That belief, which is held, is literally incoherent. It's based on the assumption that moral values reflect culture. But then that raises the next question. How does a person acquire his or her culture? I mean, you don't get it by taking a pill. You get your culture, you acquire your culture by observing a rather limited number of behaviors and actions, and from those constructing somehow in your mind the set of attitudes and beliefs that constitute your culture. But that act is very much like learning a language, or like developing a visual system, or in fact like finding a scientific theory. It's a matter of making a great leap from scattered data to some outcome. And that leap is made essentially the same way by all individuals given relatively fixed experience. And it's only possible if you have extensive built-in innate structure, just as you can develop a human rather than an insect visual system only if it's guided by genetic instructions, very specific ones. The same is true of acquisition of language, of acquisition of arithmetical capacity, acquisition of a culture, hence acquisition of moral values. But that means that the most extreme form of moral relativism is actually committed to the belief in universal values, namely those that set the frame in which this tremendous leap from data, scattered data, to a complex, relatively fixed system can take place. Now, that's why the extreme version of moral relativism, which is common, and I think Foucault professed it, is simply incoherent. If you adopt that position, you are committed to far-reaching universal values and their existence. Those that, just as if you are studying the visual system and you discover that it can vary over a wide range, you're nevertheless, in fact, by that very fact, committed to the belief that there are fixed, innate, genetically determined constraints that set the framework in which it can develop and that sort of guide the development of the structure, even though allowing a certain degree of variation. And in fact, I think that I won't talk about postmodernism, that's beyond my capacity to discuss, but just keep the postmodernism, which at least has the merit of being incoherent. I'm not sure that postmodernism even reaches that far, but it reminds me of a famous comment of a physicist, Wolfgang Pauli, who was apparently a pretty acid person and used to say sometimes when someone proposed something, that's not even false. You didn't get that far, but take these examples: slavery, subjugation of women, repression of homosexuals, and let's forget about a variety of cultures. Just think about our own. In our own culture, not that far back, these were all perfectly accepted norms. So take, say, repression of homosexuals. One of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century, Alan Turing, who also was a war hero in Britain. He's one of the people who really saved Britain from the German assault. He was instrumental in developing the techniques that decoded German signals, so the British were able to determine where the bombers were going to hit, and so on and so forth. He was killed by the British government by a forced treatment to cure his disease of homosexuality. Well, that wasn't that long ago. I mean, that was when I was a graduate student. You know, it doesn't seem very long ago to me. That's inconceivable now. You know, totally inconceivable. Moral values have advanced. I would say that what it means is that we have penetrated more deeply into our own actual moral values and seen, as the moral sphere extends, that some things that were considered completely normal and admirable are so atrocious you can't even think about them. And the same is true of slavery. Subjugation of women is very recently overcome, a long way to go yet, but changed dramatically in the last 30, 40 years. As I mentioned, beginning just with consciousness-raising groups that brought women to recognize that what they took to be normal and necessary and even acceptable is in fact completely should be totally rejected. Okay, that's same thing, widening of the moral sphere. The same is true of slavery, a little bit earlier. There still are slaves, estimated 30 million or so in the world, but it's regarded as reprehensible and totally unacceptable. And in fact, if you look at the history of overcoming of slavery in the West, there was substantially moral arguments. Incidentally, it's not that the slave owners had no arguments. They did, and it's worth attending to those arguments. In fact, some of them really have never been answered, and the fact that they're not answered gives us some insight. It's always, in fact, in general, contrary to the views of the extreme moral relativists, moral disagreements can be debated. You don't just have to scream at each other. You can look at the arguments, try to find some common ground, work from the common ground and try to reach a conclusion. That's a moral interchange, and it's often successful. So take slavery. One of the arguments during the American Civil War of the slave owners, which is a serious argument, is that they argued that they are more moral than northern industrialists for a very simple reason. They own their workers, and therefore they take care of them. Just as if you own a car, you'll take care of it. Northern industrialists rent their workers, and they don't take care of them. They have no responsibility for them. Just as if you rent a car, you probably won't take care of it. So therefore, slavery is more moral than a capitalist industrial policy. Actually, I think there's some merit to that argument. But instead of concluding from it that slavery is legitimate, we should conclude what working people in the North in the century and a half ago, we should draw their conclusion. It was a very common belief among working people in the United States that wage labor is fundamentally no different from slavery. The only difference is it's temporary. In fact, that was such a popular view that it was a slogan of the Republican Party. It was Abraham Lincoln's view. You could read it in the New York Times. It's taken a long time to drive that understanding out of people's heads, and I don't think it's driven very far. I think it's right below the surface, and it continually comes out. Incidentally, just to comment on this idea about regimes of truth, I suspect we're going to agree about this, but I mean, I think Foucault wildly exaggerates. Again, there's a kind of a truism, which is not controversial, that power systems have some effect on the way the scientific work proceeds and can be accepted and so on. Sometimes it's, at the extreme, it's a Stalinist biology. Okay, that had an effect. There's corporate influences on how drug trials are conducted. That's true. There are professional constraints. Actually, I've lived through them in my entire life. When I started my own professional work, I couldn't publish because it was too inconsistent with accepted ideas. In fact, the first book I wrote in 1955, it didn't come out for 20 years. And it came out then, it was submitted but rejected. It came out later just as kind of like for historical interest. By then, the field and developed had grown. So sure, that happens. But it's marginal. And there are self-correcting procedures in the sciences which work pretty well, not perfectly, but pretty well. So there is an element of, power relations that enter into, say, scientific work. But to talk about regimes of power, it seems to me radically overstating the case.
The real question is whether you can regard these differences within a framework of progress, in the sense that some cultures or features of culture are better than others. I mean, the real question of cultural relativism is one whether you think progress implies, as you said, an underlying innate sense, for instance, a sense of justice, or whether these cultural choices are wholly arbitrary, with none being better than it. But I mean, that's the real issue with cultural relativism.
But whatever you believe about that, there is a fixed basis. There must be a fixed basis. Otherwise, you can't acquire a culture in the first place.
No, but
And that fixed basis has to be determinative, narrowly determinative. Now, that fixed basis gives our actual human moral values. Now, if you raise the question about progress, yeah, I think there is progress. And I think it's valuable to look at our own history. So we're not talking about imperialist conquest. Our own history shows that there is moral progress. And in fact, the very examples that were given strongly illustrate it. Slavery, subjugation of women, repression of homosexuals, all of this was very common, perfectly well accepted in Western culture not very far back. In the case of, say, Turing, it was 50 years ago. It's now all regarded as completely unacceptable. I think that's evidence. It's not in discussing human affairs, you don't have proofs, we don't understand enough. But I think this is, and there's much more like it, is evidence that somehow, as our own history, culture develops, we penetrate more deeply into our actual, real, cultural and normative values. And we expand the moral sphere in fairly definite ways. These three examples are good illustrations of it. There are plenty like it.
I would like to respond to that because you see, this is exactly what you're expressing there is exactly the point of view of the Enlightenment, which is so rejected nowadays in the name of other cultures. Because if you speak of progress without our own cultures and you say this took a long time, etc., and now we look at it as a progress, but when you encounter other cultures that have not undergone this so-called progress, they will reply to you that your progress is actually a regression. Let me give you an example. Take homosexuality. Suppose there is a sacred book, a religious book, that says that this is a sin. If you allow that sin, the community will be destroyed, partly because to allow that sin is to allow for unreligious behavior and to allow for skepticism. And if skepticism spreads, then the religious culture is going to be destroyed. I have seen that in my own country, in my own life, with the Catholic culture.
Right.
Now, wait. Yeah, I know. But suppose a Muslim doesn't want to see their culture going the same way the Catholic has in this country, or the Jews, or some other sort of more traditional community, or the Catholic, whatever remains of them. I mean, you see, what do you say to them? You say your whole culture should go because homosexuality should be free?
No, in fact, I say the same thing in my own culture. It's a sin in Jewish culture.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, but
then don't you think
it's a sin in Jewish culture. I wouldn't have asked some Nazi to come along and force it to be abandoned.
No.
But I think that in the course of time, in the course of thinking through your own values, these things are overcome. Our own culture is a good example.
Okay.
Homosexuality was considered not a sin, it was considered a pathology, a sickness.
I know.
Okay, and that's recent. We've come to understand it's not a sickness. And in fact, the idea that it was, and that you should kill people.
Yeah, I know, but you think this understanding is potentially universal, so it apply all cultures?
I think it's
even those
potentially universal, and I think there are good reasons to believe it, because even if you're the most extreme moral relativist, you are presupposing universal moral values. And those can be discovered. In fact, in recent years, there's even empirical work trying to investigate them cross-culturally with children and so on. It's basically a scientific question. And we know that we have good reason to expect that there's going to be an answer. Part of the reason is just almost logic. You can't acquire a culture without having a rich, built-in array of constraints that allow the leap from scattered data to whatever it is that you acquire. I mean, that's virtually logic. And I think a look at our own history gives good illustrations. For example, looking at just the very examples that are given here, it's been a long battle, but over time, in fact, the last couple of centuries, there's been a very consistent change. And the change is not without conflict, but it's going in a particular direction. And I think you can even understand the direction. The direction is towards more tolerance of variation and more opposition to coercion and control. I think that's a very definite tendency. And I think it suggests something pretty strong about what our fundamental moral values are.